We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
Hey, welcome along. On tonight's Mark Steyn show, let's face it, the people who are running the world are nuts and getting nuttier. Australian Senator Alex Antic will give us his thoughts on that. Britain is returning the spoils of empire. David Starkey will weigh in. That's not David there, actually. That's one of the artifacts from Benin that is to be returned. Yeah, that is David. That's definitely his spear there. David Starkey, where once we dispatched men in ostrich-feathered helmets to wield vice-regal power around the planet, we now have diversity czars, cracking the diversity whip right here at home. But what does the diversity czar do all day long? We'll try to find out from Sophie Corcoran. And do you remember interest rates? It's not quite as far back as the heights of empire, but it's getting there. The heights of interest rates were also the heights of disco and the heights of Roger Moore as 007 arching his eyebrow like a graph of inflation projections, and the heights of cheesecloth shirt collars that look like the doors of a DeLorean motorcar. Well, disco and DeLorean aren't coming back, but interest rates are. How terrified should you be? We'll ask Jasmine Birtles. Plus, the most vital part of the show, all the more important when we live in the constant swirl of a blizzard of lies. Your comments and questions, do shoot them to me by email, gbviews@gbnews.uk, or you can Twitter me at gbnews. But first, as ever, the latest headlines with Polly Middlehurst.
Mark, thank you. Good evening. The news just after 8 o'clock. Scotland's First Minister has called for an urgent meeting with the heads of UK government to address the cost of living crisis. Nicola Sturgeon has written to the Prime Minister warning the UK can't afford to wait until September for further action to be taken. Downing Street has rejected calls by the former Prime Minister Gordon Brown to hold a Cobra meeting on the situation. It says Boris Johnson has no plans to bring in new fiscal measures before the end of his premiership. The Shadow Armed Forces Minister Luke Pollard told us there really are families and pensioners struggling right now.
We don't see bolder measures taken now, not waiting until the autumn, then I fear we're going to see an increase in deprivation, increase in hunger, and more people turning off their heating in the winter months, which we know will only lead to more health problems and further pressure on an NHS that's already in crisis.
A young girl has died after a house collapsed following a gas explosion in South London. The Metropolitan Police believes the victim was 4 years old. Nearby homes were also damaged by the blast, which happened in Thornton Heath. 3 people are in hospital, whilst a 4th person was treated at the scene. A police investigation is now underway. Jurors have heard former Manchester United player Ryan Giggs was idolised on the football pitch, but had an ugly, more sinister side in his private life. The former winger, who's on trial at Manchester Crown Court accused of assaulting and controlling his girlfriend, allegedly used controlling and coercive behaviour against Kate Greville between August 2017 and November 2020. He's also charged with assaulting her younger sister. He's denied all the charges. And 50 properties have been damaged and 4 people have been rescued after a burst water main flooded an area in North London. Roads were closed as 3 feet of water swept through streets in Islington, creating 2 sinkholes. Thames Water has apologised to affected customers. And it comes as several water companies put hosepipe bans in place amid a prolonged spell of dry weather. And a heat health warning has been put in place for parts of England from tomorrow until Saturday, as the UK braces itself for another heat wave. The UK Health Security Agency is advising people to look out for older people or those with existing health conditions. The Met Office says temperatures won't hit the highs of 40 degrees like last time, but they could reach up to 35. You're up to date on TV, online and on DAB+ radio. You're with GB News, where now it's time for Mark Steyn.
Quick update on a story we brought you last Monday. 5 coppers from the disgraceful Hampshire Constabulary were dispatched to arrest Darren Brady for retweeting a meme, as they say on the internet. They offered him a deal, the kind of deal you'd normally get from a mob boss. They wouldn't prosecute him if he agreed to cough up some dosh and attend some crappy sensitivity training re-education camp. This is an obvious and crude shakedown racket, so he told them to take a hike. They cuffed him and dragged him off. This in a neighbourhood where there have been 83 burglaries, all 83 of them unsolved. Well, Hampshire Police had a few bad days publicity-wise, and they've now scrapped entirely their hate awareness re-education course. Good riddance to that. Maybe now you guys could get off your collectively flabby arse and actually solve 1 or 2 of those 83 burglaries. Like to give that a try? It's not as easy as just going around and handcuffing somebody for his retweet, but you might like to give it a go. You might find it actually rewarding work. Unfamiliar, but rewarding. The Speaker of the House of Representatives is the second in line to the presidency of the United States, just in case Joe Biden and Kamala Harris should become mentally incapacitated. I mean, more mentally incapacitated than they evidently are already. The White House is apparently the world champion limbo dance of fitness for office. Anyway, Speaker Pelosi is on a diplomatic tour and demonstrating her usual finesse.
When I was a little girl, I was told at the beach if I dug a hole deep enough, we would reach China. So we've always felt a connection.
So there's always a connection there when you're on the beach and you're digging the hole down to China. She has hundreds of staffers and a full team of writers, but don't laugh, because that's the story of today's United States in one perfect Pelosi soundbite. America has dug itself a huge hole, and waiting at the bottom of it is China. And that's true for the rest of the West, too. We're all a long way down a deep hole that leads nowhere but China. We are increasingly governed by the kind of madmen you don't find terribly often outside the ranks of Bond villains. It would be nice if they'd all push off and live together in a hollowed-out volcano on a remote island with cat-suited henchmen careering around in golf buggies. Unfortunately, that tends to attract unwelcome attention from MI6, whereas going on national TV and proclaiming that farming farming, the organizing principle of human existence since man gave up hunter-gathering, proclaiming that farming is an indulgence the world cannot afford, is now apparently perfectly normal.
I can hear farmers all over this small country of ours shocked and perhaps screaming at their televisions because they're saying, are you saying all animal farming, in your opinion, really needs to stop?
Yes, it does. It really does. It's a bit like leaving fossil fuels in the ground. Unless we do that, we've really got very little chance indeed of preventing this domino effect of system collapse right across Earth systems, which basically makes the planet uninhabitable. So eating meat and milk and eggs is an indulgence we cannot afford.
That's The Guardian's George Monbiot telling Irish farmers it's time to retrain as diversity consultants or transgender swimmers. The last 2.5 years ought to be a comprehensive repudiation of the expert class because they've screwed everything. The economy is kaput, inflation is rampant, our measures to combat the COVID did more damage than the COVID. And now the same geniuses who've wrecked everything they touch want to apply that self-same COVID model to their real bugbear, climate change, and destroy the food chain. Here's what one Australian senator has to say about it.
Anyone who's been paying even the slightest amount of attention can see that many of the so-called experts have been wrong on virtually every point in the last 2 years, from lockdowns to the injections being safe and effective. Bureaucrats like to keep the fear alive to solidify their own importance and therefore their own funding. And if there's one word I never want to hear again, it's modelling. When was the last model that was proven in hindsight to be accurate? It's not just the COVID experience which bells the cat on the rise of big government. One only has to look at the intrusions by government into our lives in areas like the climate, the surveillance state and the rise of the quasi-state operatives.
That's Senator Alex Adtick of South Australia, just kind of warming up there, but he'll be here to give it with both barrels a little later. And he's not wrong. Today's received wisdom is the wisdom of utopian megalomaniac lunatics on which things like experience, perspective, reality are not permitted to intrude. There are victims of the madness. We've talked to, for example, a small number of the thousands of girls from all over England who've been the victims of the industrial-scale child rape gangs that operate with impunity from the industrial north to the leafy home counties. Rishi Sunak, as part of his campaign to become next month's Prime Minister, is now pledging to set up a grooming gangs task force.
I have two young girls who are 9 and 11, and I think for too long we just haven't focused on this issue, Philip. And it's a horrific crime that is affecting actually not just girls in a few places, it's far more pervasive across the country than actually we all realise. And we all know the reason that people don't focus on it. It's because of political correctness, and they're scared of calling out the fact that there's a particular group of people who are perpetuating these crimes, and I think that's wrong.
Rishi Sunak butching up, quote, they're scared of calling out the fact that there's a particular group of people that are perpetuating these crimes, and I think that's wrong. He didn't himself get terribly particular on which particular group of people it was. They're from particular Stan, which is in, quote, Asia, home to 60% of the world's population, so that helpfully narrows it down. Are these particular people down the Azerbaijani end or the North Korean, up near Siberia, or down south near Pakistan? Whoa, whoa, whoa! Don't go there, girlfriend. A particular group of people is as particular as Rishi Sunak is going to get about these particular Stani people. He doesn't want to be damned as a racist hater, exercising his pasty white privilege. This is what passes for courage in British politics, and it's interesting that Rishi, like everyone else, cheerfully admits that nothing gets done because of the racial sensitivities. So because we're so exquisitely sensitive to the joys of diversity, the child rape will continue. Diversity is a morally neutral concept. If you didn't know that before Rotherham and Telford and Oldham, you certainly should now. We'll explore that with Sophie Corcoran a bit later. But first, next month's Prime Minister is going to have to be some kind of genius The British state has been digging a hole as enthusiastically as Nancy Pelosi on the beach, and the chickens would be coming home to roost had not Bill Gates and Greta Thunberg called for the culling of all poultry on the grounds that poultry is an indulgence we can no longer afford. So instead, the Bill Gates free-range cockroaches and locusts are coming home to roost. Last week, the Bank of England announced the biggest interest rate increase in 27 years, which takes us all the way back to the days when interest rates were a thing before money became free. Jasmine Buttles of the Money Magpie joins me, and it's always good to see you, Jasmine. What's the significance of what the Bank of England did?
Well, they're saying, they're sort of demonstrating that they want to curb inflation. Too little, too late. You could say too much, too late at this stage, actually, because we are effectively coming into stagflation, where you have a stagnant economy but rampant inflation. And the way to deal with those two is quite opposite.
Yeah.
You know, with stagnant economy, you open the floodgates, you create more money, or, you know, make it easier to borrow. With inflation, you have to reduce the flow of money. So I think they're trying to do both, and of course won't manage it. Raising interest rates by 0.5%, I truly don't think is going to make a hugely good difference. I think people are already stopping spending. So merely increasing interest rates is just going to make it harder for people with mortgages ultimately, and those that have to borrow, basically.
Well, we have the worst inflation basically since the 70s now, but we don't, I mean, interest rates in the late 70s hit 17%. You know, when people are going, ooh, over 1.75%, there's a long way to go still, isn't there?
Well, there really is, and it does show that the problems that we have created for ourselves over the last, well, at least 15 years, I would say, because we have had historically, well, nothing, literally nothing interest rates, plus quantitative easing, money printing. So we've had about the loosest financial situation you could possibly have. And in that environment, we've had rocketing house prices, which is certainly partly because of, you know, supply and demand, but primarily because of incredibly cheap money, to the point where most millennials and Gen Zers can't afford a house of their own. And we also had an extraordinary number of businesses that have started and not made any profit at all, but have been able to do it because they've had all this cheap money. This is reversing, or it seems to be reversing. How long it's going to last, I don't know, because we have the war in Ukraine, we have a recession potentially, so they might actually bring interest rates down again. We really can't know at this stage.
On the continent at one point, they were actually paying you to borrow money.
Yeah.
There's a huge psychological gulf between that and 17% in the 70s.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that has changed is that a lot more people are on fixed-rate mortgages, but those fixed-rate mortgages aren't forever.
No, exactly. And you've got a lot of people whose mortgages will be finishing probably this year. 75%, three-quarters of mortgage holders have a fixed rate, which is great. Now, if you've got a 10-year rate and you've just, you know, started it, well, good for you, you'll be all right. But a lot of people, yes, in the next 12, 24 months, they will be needing to remortgage. And yeah, it's going to be harder at that point, definitely.
You mentioned that stagflation it has a completely different strategy from inflation. We're also in a slightly weird situation more broadly here, because the government massively intervened in the economy 2 years ago and basically killed it stone cold dead. So is this actually, do traditional theories of stagflation and inflation apply when it's as artificial a situation as this one?
Well, I think it's a very good point, because not just in this country, but, you know, across the West, we have central bankers that it seemed to my mind, have just messed things up, essentially. Because, I mean, I remember in 2008, I thought at the time, oh, well, they're bailing out the banks to look after everybody. But actually, it wasn't. They shouldn't have done that. What we should be doing is letting the banks fail. And we do have a broken banking system, just to add to our joys. We do have broken banks, and they need to be allowed to fail. But at the moment, certainly over the last 10, 15 years, they haven't been allowed to, because we have central banks, bank of last resort. Anybody's got a problem, oh, here's another few billion, that'll keep you propped up. And so you have essentially zombie banks. We are banking in many cases with zombie banks, and that is not healthy in any way, shape or form.
Well, that begs, and the other thing is that the type of person who becomes a central banker these days, I think, has changed since this. I mean, Mark Carney was governor of the Bank of Canada, and that wasn't big enough for him. So he then became governor of the Bank of England, and that isn't big enough for him. So he's now sidekick to Klaus Schwab at Davos or whatever. So his world plans don't seem to take into account the lives that ordinary citizens lead.
Absolutely, yes. And with inflation, certainly, and recession, it is the lives of ordinary people that are being immediately impacted. And inflation is what we, as the consumer, pay for the sins, if you like, of our masters, of our lords and masters. Inflation is entirely self-created. It's created by governments, and we, the consumers, the workers, we end up paying for it.
But isn't that also different from the 70s? Because the advantage in the 70s is that, yes, the government was responsible for inflation, but it had done it sort of gradually with stupid policies that had percolated up over a decade and a half. Here, everyone knows that the state basically said, we know everything. We know when you should leave your house. We know when you're allowed to take a walk in the park. We know when you're allowed to go to a restaurant. And the result is what we see all around us.
Absolutely. And, I think it has been happening gradually because we have been producing far too much money since 2008, but that money's been going into the banks to waste in their own special way. But yes, when it came to 2020 onwards, the idea of just dampening the economy totally so that you don't produce the goods and services you need, and at the same time exponentially increasing the amount of money, printing it like sweets.
Well, and paying people to go and basically paying people to go out to get a cheeseburger at McDonald's.
Yes. Yeah, well, absolutely. Yes, and what we have now is too much money chasing too few goods and services, and also a whole swathe of people who have got rather used, thank you very much, to sitting at home and being paid to do nothing, as you say, or, being paid to go out and get a cheeseburger. And who wouldn't want to keep doing that? It makes perfect sense. Just stay at home. Why not?
I don't think Keynes, in all his writings, actually has a situation where he deals with the government paying people to go out and eat cheeseburgers. Absolutely. That is an innovation that was left to our own time. Thank you very much, Jasmine. Always good to see you.
Thank you.
Your reaction up next, GB Views at GB News, plus David Starkey, Sophie Corcoran, and an Australian senator of the type we could use at Westminster, Alex Antic, will be here. Stick around, we're coming right back.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GBNews.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, mate. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
GB News is the People's Channel, so let's hear what the people have to say. We wanted to know whether there was anything that could be done to turn this stinker of a situation around. And Milky says, yes, there is a way. So this is Milky's way. Yep, he says, or she says, kick all the foreign energy suppliers out, stop sending money to Ukraine, and tax the sickening profits companies like BP and Shell are making. You know why BP and Shell would like to make some profits? Because the entire political class of the Western world, including boy genius Boris Johnson, has said he's going to put them all out of business by the year 2030. So they got, 8 years left to make any profits, and then they're going to be like the horse and buggy in the automobile age by 2030. And I love that, the way, oil is evil. Oil, we have to, we're going to channel cockroach flatulence and power your motor vehicles by that. Oil is totally evil. But in the meantime, would you mind actually producing some more so we can have some of the more evil stuff and take the price of the evil stuff down? There's no reason for BP. BP, by the way, pandered to these people. BP used to stand for British Petroleum, and then they became ashamed of that name and started, their ads would say, Beyond Petroleum. Yes, we've got all this petroleum, but we'd like to be powered by wind. There's a wind turbine on Rock Hall that's going to power everything in the United Kingdom. So you've demonized these people, and they're going to be out of business in 2030, but you'd like them to be more cooperative about being put out of business. As to Ukraine, yes, you're right. There's no more money in the UK. We've made all the money we're going to make basically until the 22nd century, and it does get mildly irritating every time the government finds another fourpence, 3 farthing down the back of the Downing Street sofa that they feel the need to send it over to Mr. Zelensky, who seems to be, I mean, is he spending it just on his wardrobe and photo ops with Hollywood actresses? Anyway, Andy says stop printing the money would be a start. Yeah, maybe you're right. We should try being the first country without any currency. Andrew says it's only just started, 50% on its way. I don't know whether he's talking about inflation or interest rates, but if we're going like the 70s on steroids, it'll be both. Liberty Bell says, I'm no economist, but I think we should go back to a gold-backed monetary system instead of paper notes backed by nothing. Stop printing money, cut taxes, and encourage growth. Fire up our energy reserves and scrap net zero. That'll be a start. Inflation has increased over time. You're right about the net zero. The story of the last 2 years is one of comprehensive failure by the expert class, whose expertise is mostly rubbish. Case in point, Dr. Sarah Kyatt.
Well, what's really excellent is, and it's a statistic that I think should be shouted from the rooftops, is that after 12 days from the first vaccination of the AstraZeneca vaccine, you are 100% effective against hospitalization and death. So, you know, those are the statistics we need to be hearing.
Why haven't we heard that before?
Why haven't we heard that bit? Well, you're going to hear it now every night because it's so bloody ridiculous, as even Dr. Kayat must know. In the most recent UK government figures for April and May, the vaccinated comprise over 90% of the dead. So much for that 100% protection, which guarantee she surely knew she was in no position to give. But she'll never have to fear being investigated by Ofcom, unlike yours truly. In fact, she's been taken on by another morning show and being presented as an expert on the monkeypox. What, by the way, what morning show is that she's on? GBNews morning show. She should be GBNews should be ashamed of herself. I think we should have an Ofcom investigation into GBNews about why they're having. By the way, what channel am I on? Oh, GBNews. Can you make the cue cards bigger next time? I can't be expected to keep all this stuff in my head. Enough with the groupthink of the transnational expert class. South Australian Senator Alex Antic put it this way in the Aussie Parliament in Canberra.
This is Australia, not the People's Republic of China. We should be governed by the lowest and least centralised level of authority as possible to preserve our basic freedoms, including freedom of movement, speech and choice. It's time we scaled back the power of these bureaucracies, and it's time that politicians who say they love this country to go out and prove it. It's time we drain the billabong.
It's time we drain the billabong, a word formerly of exclusively Australian application, but fetid, toxic billabongs are now to be found all over the UK, Canada and elsewhere in Her Majesty's Dominion. Senator Antic joins me now. Senator, that was a magnificent performance in Canberra. Are you slightly surprised at the way half the population of Australia, like half the population of the UK, like half the population of Canada, is still prepared to defer to these experts even after they've wrecked everything?
Well, look, Mark, thanks for having me on, and congratulations on the show, by the way, doing great work on these very subjects. So I'm an avid viewer, but look, I think I'm not really, because I think what we've seen is this sort of top-down style of government, this sort of groupthink approach to policy emerge over the last 2 years. It's actually been growing longer than that, of course, been growing for decades, but it's now started to gain a huge amount of momentum under COVID. And we saw the same things here. We saw what we called our chief health officers, who were in each state, the head, the sort of the Anthony Fauci's of each particular state, if you like, spouting the same wisdom over and over again with no basis upon which to do so. And in fact, I sought information from local versions of that saying, well, tell us the science this is based on. Of course, the science was null and void. So we're seeing this sort of expertisation of politics, which is actually just politics in itself. It's really just politics overriding science. It's almost become endemic.
It's also anti-democratic, because one of the common features of this is that legislatures became less important over the last few years. Oppositions didn't really want to oppose vigorously. In many cases, they agreed. They just wanted more of this stuff. Yet we notice common things now around the Western world. You have excess mortality in Australia, as they do in many European countries, as they do in the United States. And yet the media is still in March 2020 mode and doesn't really want to investigate any of this stuff.
We've seen almost no investigation of this, and it's a common complaint for me here. In fact, in Australia in the last 4 months, we've had something like 8,500 excess deaths over and above the normal, the baseline average. Now, that represents about 16.8%, which is pretty common across the Western world.
Yeah.
And yet there has been almost no commentary about that. It's been this incredible period of fear-mongering, and the fear has led to people happily sacrificing their liberty at the altar of safety, if you like. And in Australia, we've seen a similar thing across all of our states. Each state parliament has effectively handed over power to the bureaucracy. Here in my home state of South Australia, we did that for 2 years under the guise of a so-called emergency. And what really that equated to was the bureaucracy taking over the reins. We had, public health officials and the chief police officer calling the shots on almost everything. It's sort of bizarre, but what the thing that really alarms me is that COVID is the beginning of that. We're seeing that same model rolling out now from this so-called declarations of climate emergencies all over the Western world. I think that model is going to be repeated. The sort of the politics of emergency and the emergency direction is the greatest danger to democracy in 2022.
You made an interesting point with respect to the Commonwealth Games, where it turns out that an Australian cricketer has basically been allowed in to infect the entirety of the British Isles. And you pointed out that this was in striking contrast to the treatment of a Serbian tennis player when he wanted to come to Australia. So there's no consistency about any of this stuff, is there?
Well, no, there never was. I mean, the decision to not allow Novak to come in really, just it wasn't based in scientific fact. And now we see the dial shifting, and we have a Commonwealth Games athlete who was allowed to play despite being COVID positive. And, I think the Australian team won the gold medal, which is a good thing. But in the meantime, there's been all these reports about wearing masks instead of isolating and all this sort of thing. The dial seems to have shifted here. And so, we're seeing things in South Australia and Victoria and New South Wales that 6 months ago would have shut the state down, but now all of a sudden, X number of cases doesn't seem to be a big issue. So what happened to the science? Was it the case all along that science was just about politics? I think that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, it's like political science, which doesn't mean quite what it used to. Thank you. Thank you very much, Alec. I'm cowering in fear over that Australian at the Commonwealth Games. I'm not going within 200 miles of Birmingham until he's on a plane back to Sydney. Thank you very much, Alex. Keep it up. We could use a few more like you at Westminster, so if you fancy being in the House of Lords, let me know and I'll mention it to Liz Truss. I said earlier that diversity was a morally neutral concept, and it is. It's not per se a virtue. A group of 5 pasty white ladies from the Women's Institute is completely non-diverse. A group of 5 white pasty ladies from the Women's Institute plus Sudan's leading clitoridectomist is more diverse, but not necessarily the better for it. So it was faintly disturbing to me when adult persons, other than those employed by US educational institutions or the wimpier outposts of the Church of England, began using the word diversity in a non-parodic sense. Diversity is our strength, diversity is inclusive, diversity is vibrant, and above all, diversity is where the big bucks are. During Barack Obama's rise to greatness in Illinois, the University of Chicago hospitals thought it politic to put his missus on the payroll as a diversity consultant. $316,962 per annum, plus benefits, for a job so necessary to the hospital that when Mrs. Obama quit to become First Lady, they didn't bother replacing her. I'd sort of assumed that Diversicrats face down in that much gravy was mostly an American phenomenon, but it seems Her Majesty's government has now got the diversity fevers too. Sophie Corcoran is with us, and Sophie, you actually produced chapter and verse on how many of these guys there are in the government.
Yep, so in HMRC alone, there's 16 of them costing about £3 million in the last couple of years. But the NHS is the biggest culprit for this. They have 165 diversity chiefs, costing us up to 6.8 million. So remember, next time you are waiting 3 hours for an ambulance, they won't be able to help you, but thank the Lord that if they do get there, they'll be able to tell you your pronouns, if obviously you're not dead by them.
Yeah, that's actually the issue, isn't it? The NHS, they've got no dentists, but they've got diversity bureaucrats.
What do they do? Diversity chiefs can't solve cancer. They can't help anybody. They don't do anything. What is the requirement to become a diversity chief? Nothing.
What do they do? You said they were at HMRC. What the hell does a diversity guy do at the Treasury? Because that's actually the one thing that's impeccably diverse. They tax everybody.
Yep.
Well, how would you go about saying we need to make HM Treasury more diverse. I mean, what's that about?
Well, I don't even think it's a treasury. I think it should be across all things as well as the NHS. I don't care what colour my doctor is. I would just like to be able to see one, but unfortunately I can't because they've got so many diversity chiefs.
No, that's true, actually.
Per every diversity chief, you can hire 3 nurses. They can hire, I think, in terms of their cash loss, they've also got green chiefs. Environment, they've got 86 green staff as well that are also earning millions together. If you add those together, 16,000 nurses on a full-time salary you could get if we stop wasting money on woke positions.
But what I don't get is what a diversity officer does every day. I mean, if someone, I don't know a lot about plumbing, but I broadly understand what a plumber does when he sets about his work. But I have no idea what a diversity guy does when he gets to the office at 9 in the morning. What does he do for the next 8, or she, or whatever, because I take it they're diverse. But what does he, she, they do when they get in for the next 8 hours?
I'm assuming just make up fake microaggressions. But you said something earlier, which is how diversity is a strength. I think this obsession with diversity is a danger. I mean, look at the grooming gangs. I mean, I dare anybody that thinks that this whole idea of white privilege exists, I dare any one of them to go up to those thousands of girls in Telford or Rochdale and tell them that because they were raped and it was systematically covered up by the police and the government because they were white, I dare anyone to go and tell those girls that they have white privilege. I dare you. I literally dare you.
Oddly enough, people do in those towns. They seem to think that diversity is such a desirable goal that basically, you know, to rewrite that apocryphal remark by Queen Victoria, those girls just should lie back and think of diversity, basically. I mean, that's what the regimes in those cities are telling them.
It's dangerous. It's wasting us millions of pounds in terms of our economy. It is putting young female girls at risk. It's terrible for social mobility because, as we know, young white working class boys are the most left behind in education. And there was a recent poll saying that white people proportionately were the least likely to go to Russell Group unis. Do you think that we have diversity schemes? We don't get any whites-only scholarships. We don't get any whites-only diversity schemes and bursaries, even though we are the least likely to progress because it doesn't suit their diversity agenda. So, you know, I dare anybody to go up to a white working class boy who's been left behind and tell them they've got white privilege. I dare you. It doesn't exist. And this obsession with diversity is why our culture is falling to pieces.
Well, what's so weird is that, I mean, America, which was a couple of decades ahead of us, and the same phenomena that it was poor rural whites who were the biggest victims of this racket. But Britain at the highest levels seems to have embraced it, you know, like dull Whitehall bureaucrats who you wouldn't have thought would get this kind of madness in there, and now somehow want to be as woke as the wokest Starbucks
because
barista.
there's a lot of money in it, though. I mean, look at Black Lives Matter. The Black Lives Matter organisers, they have like mansions, like loads of. There's a lot of money in diversity, in wokeness, so it's attractive because in normal capitalist societies, you want to go where the money is, and that unfortunately is where the money is at the minute. That's through businesses, through high office politicians, through most people, and especially people who are on £100,000 salary to be a diversity officer. If you could earn £100,000 to do absolutely nothing, I would sign me up.
Oh no, I wouldn't. If you compared to actually doing a proper day's work, I'd rather be a diversity consultant any day of the week. In fact, I may be in the market for that job if Ofcom have their way. But you are, you're completely right there about the money, except that diversity, multiculturalism is a unicultural phenomenon. You can't go to Saudi Arabia and become a diversity
Well, just
consultant.
look at the football. The outrage of the BBC that said all the English girls are white.
Yeah.
Would you say that about the Nigerian team?
No.
No, of course they wouldn't. It's only a problem if the person is white.
No, and we also understand, we used to understand that certain professions attract different kinds of people. If you went to see the West End revival of Hello Dolly, you wouldn't say, too many of the fetching young gentlemen of the chorus are gay and there's not enough Muslims in the chorus Hello Dolly, because we used to understand that certain areas are more attractive to certain types of people. I mean, we've
It's the same as bin men. They want to get women to be bin men. What woman wants to go? Most women do not want to go in the blistering heat handling rubbish bags. That's just not something women want to do. So stop trying to force us to do it for your diversity. We just don't want to. Things are just that way for a reason.
No, okay, we're going to need a female rewrite of My Old Man's a Dustman. He wears Blimey trousers. I don't know what a woman does. Does a woman dustman wear Blimey trousers? I haven't seen a lot of them lately. Thank you very much, Sophie. Great to see you. Stump the Steyn is looming. GB Views at GB News. Plus, David Starkey on punitive expeditions in an age of self-flagellation. Don't touch that dial. We're coming right back.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk down to you.
We embrace all voices with honest and civilised conversation.
We are not part of the establishment.
We're one of you.
And we're only getting started.
Join us on GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today.
I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked.
Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
We have some breaking news for you. Dame Olivia Newton-John has died at the age of 73 after a long battle with breast cancer. She was a marvellous singer and a grand survivor. She was inducted into the Order of the British Empire and the Order of Australia within the same year, just a couple of years back. So she became a dame very belatedly from the point of view of some of us. If you've ever seen a film called A Few Best Men, she's absolutely hilarious in that, off her face on cocaine, which is completely opposite from the way she is in Greece. Talented lady, talented songwriter in the early days too. Olivia Newton-John, Dame Olivia, is dead at 73. British history is world history because the British Empire was the most geographically extensive empire in the history of the planet. That's the good news, makes you proud to be British and all that, especially when you see the 72 nations and territories representing 1/3 of humanity at the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham. The bad news is that by its very nature, British history as curated in UK museums includes a lot of stuff from elsewhere, and many of the chaps from elsewhere would like it back. The so-called Benin Bronzes are second only to the Elgin marbles in the demands for their repatriation. They're very striking, and they were seized following the massacre by troops of the Kingdom of Benin, of the British Vice Consul and all but 2 of his party. Not just the English chappies, but the Benin troops killed over 200 African porters too. Here are the 2 fellows who survived. That is Captain Boiragon, Chief Constable of Niger Protectorate's Constabulary, and District Commissioner Locke of Wari. That was in 1896. And when they reported back what had happened, the following year, London dispatched a so-called Punitive Expedition to teach the natives that it's not in their interest to catch John Bullseye. It was a bloody encounter. The Punitive Expedition targeted the palaces and sacred sites of Benin's bigwigs, looting them and then torching them. The British had little respect for Benin culture because it involved a fair bit of human sacrifice, so putting the Kingdom of Benin out of business seemed an enlightened policy. Benin City is now in southern Nigeria, and 72 of those bronzes are presently at the Horniman Museum in southeast London and have been since arriving from West Africa in 1897. But the Horniman says they're going home to Nigeria. What are we to make of this? The eminent historian, Dr. David Starkey, is here. Is this a good idea or not, David?
I think what we've really got to do is to examine the principles. The two things that are very important. The first is, and you've referred to it briefly, the nature of the Kingdom of Benin. It is one of the oldest, the most organized of African kingdoms. It is, of course, based fundamentally on slavery. It was at the absolute center of the slave trade, capturing the enemies of the kingdom and selling them on, especially to Portuguese, to Arab slave traders for export. It's as simple as that. So the notion that there is some sort of moral virtue there is nonsense. The second thing is, and this I think is much the more important, these bronzes, when they were in Benin, were largely, in fact, I imagine, entirely unknown outside. It is the fact that they come to the West that turns them from objects of an obscure religious cult, which, as you say, could involve human sacrifice, into art objects. The notion that these things are art is a complete Western invention. It's only once these objects are in museums, first in London and then throughout Western Europe, that a few years later, remember, look at the dates you've been talking about, the late 1890s. This is the moment at which modernism is beginning to bubble up through the surfaces of the Victorian world, and it will explode in the works of Picasso and whatever, who take these things as deliberately anti-Renaissance, anti-realist, anti-Western art, and they build on them. So the idea that these are great works of art is incomprehensible within the context of Africa. It makes sense only within the context of the West. And I think we can again go further, because you've made the comparison with the Elgin marbles. You've also forgotten, you haven't of course, you haven't time to say, there's also the whole history of Egypt and the Rosetta Stone. What's going on is, and what we are forgetting is, and I'm going to say something that's even outrageous, Mark, for David Starkey, we invented the idea of not simply empire, we didn't invent the idea of empire, we invented really the idea of history itself. These places had no concept of history. Clearly, somewhere like China did and somewhere like Japan did. But for most of the world, the very notion of history, of culture, of art is itself a Western invention. These things, the bronzes, were cultic objects. The Elgin marbles were completely ignored. The idea of Greece is a British and German invention. It was a satrapy of the Turkish Empire, of the Ottoman Empire. These things were treated with simply contempt. It is the bringing of those extraordinary sculptors to London that leads to this explosion of interest. You can actually see it within a few years of their arrival in London. You have the internal decorations of the newly built Buckingham Palace modelled on them. There's this extraordinary frieze in the actual throne room Buckingham Palace that shows English history remodelled in the light of the Elgin marbles, with centering on the marriage of Henry VII to Elizabeth of York in bizarrely sort of Greek fashion. So do you see what I mean? The idea that these places had a history that we robbed them of it is preposterous. It was simply the bringing of these objects here and the study of them that creates the notion of a Greece. I mean, even the notion of a country, let alone the notion of a culture. And the same is true with the Benin Bronzes, and again, the idea of art, and even more so with Egypt. Do you know what the Rosetta Stone was used as? It was a corner of a stable.
No.
It was a piece of rubble.
Right. No, you're absolutely right that the very idea of a building where civilizational artifacts are displayed and studied is a Western concept. So why then are we so mired in self-loathing, particularly after something like this punitive expedition, that we feel it is the moral thing to return these to a kingdom that no longer exists?
And indeed, to a country which is falling apart and is permanently falling apart. And heaven knows what will happen to them when they go back. Look at the fate of the antiquaries that were in Iraq, the fate of those that experienced the Taliban, and so on. The idea, I mean, you didn't even mention the word, the very idea of a museum, the very idea of artifacts telling us about the history, the culture, the past, the different ways of living is an entirely Western notion. That's right. There we have it. And a building, of course, consciously built in imitation of Greek architecture, as was reinterpreted and re-understood. If you look at the buildings in Greece in the late 18th, early 19th century, they're Ottoman hovels. It's if you want to see the development of the ideas of Greece, as the whole notion of ancient Greek literature and so on, it's essentially a Western phenomenon. I mean, what we're doing is, and I think you and I have played with these ideas before, the idea of sending these things back is fundamentally part of our repudiation of our own culture. It's part of our repudiation of our own culture, our own history, and above all, our own, and this is a terribly German Hegelian phrase, world historical importance. These things were invented in the West, particularly between London and Paris.
Yep, that's a brilliant way of putting it, and it will drive all the right people nuts, including the director of the Horniman Museum, who is returning, has decided to be the first British government-funded institution to return these things. David Starkey, thank you very much. It's always good to see you. I think we can do a couple of stumps. Kay says, China tried to kill us with the virus. They now tried to kill us with their weather satellite. China is actually quite serious about defeating us and will use whatever it has to hand. That's what makes China it's basically taken over the world without firing a shot. Doing it the old-fashioned way, like sending billions in weapons to countries, or like occupying countries for 20 years and then losing to goat herds with fertilizer, is the old-fashioned way. China doesn't bother with that. It's taking over the world without firing a shot. That's going to do it. Dan Wooden is here to macerate your Monday. What do you got, Dan?
Well, Mark, lots coming up, but just reacting to begin with to the news that you broke there within your show of the death of Olivia Newton-John. Do you know, Mark, Grease, it is my favourite movie of all time. I was a child when it came out. I learned far too much, about some of the shadier sides of the world through Olivia and John. And what I loved as the years went on is she never ran away from the legacy of Grease. You know how some Hollywood stars get too big for their boots? She knew that movie made her who she was. So we're going to be celebrating the life of Olivia Newton-John at the top of the show. And then what went down when I went to the Tory party hustings in Eastbourne on Friday night.
Okay, so you got the important stuff with Livy, and then the peripheral stuff like Troy. As I mentioned, she wrote songs in the late 60s, early 70s, and one of them I absolutely love and is as good as anything done by the professionals. Great stuff, Dan. All coming up after the weather. Stay safe, stay free, and give a thought to Dame Olivia. We'll see you tomorrow.
Evening, Alex Deegan here with your latest weather update from the Met Office. Pretty warm today, but temperatures are only going to rise through the rest of this week. And if you're after rainfall, well, you're out of luck. It's going to be dry for the vast majority, certainly through this week, thanks to this area of high pressure. Now, it's not completely fine and sunny everywhere. We've had this weather front across northern Scotland today, bringing cloud and outbreaks of rain, and that will continue on and off across the Northern Highlands, the Western Isles and the Northern Isles through the night. Elsewhere, though, most places dry with light winds. We could just see a little bit of mist and fog forming through the early hours across parts of eastern England, but it's not going to last on Tuesday morning. A warmish night, but not that oppressive. Temperatures are going to be rising, though, both by day and by night through the rest of this week. It is going to be another sunny day then for the vast majority on Tuesday. Quite a lot of cloud across northern Scotland still, but not as much in the way of rainfall. The rain tending to ease, except perhaps in Shetland. But even here it may turn dry come the afternoon. Quite a bit of cloud across the northwest and the breeze picking up here then, but elsewhere lots of sunshine, temperatures mid to high 20s, probably topping out at 30 Celsius tomorrow somewhere across the southeast. On Tuesday evening, again, it's fine, it's dry and it's sunny. Perhaps a bit more of a breeze picking up across Kent and certainly getting quite windy across the far northwest where it will stay predominantly cloudy. Maybe one or two light showers as we head into Wednesday. But again, for most places, Wednesday is another sunny day. If anything, sunnier across the Highlands and certainly through Orkney, where we could see temperatures up to 19 or 20. And elsewhere, we'll be in the mid-20s widely, high 20s across the south, probably peaking in the low 30s somewhere close to London. Again, some coasts will be cooler, where there'll be some pleasant sea breezes developing. The outlook is for more of the same. Hints of a change into next week, but for the vast majority of the sunshine continuing into the weekend and temperatures rising further.
We are GB News.
We're right across this great nation.
On TV.
On radio.
On digital. Absolutely everywhere.
We don't talk